Welcome to Name 3 Songs. I'm Sarah Fagan.
I'm Jenna Million, and this is a podcast where we discuss feminist issues in music and pop culture, all while empowering fangirls. Because let's be honest, fangirls knew about that band way before you did.
And if you stick around long enough, we'll also let you in on some new music the girls are already crazy about.
How's everyone been? I feel like we haven't had a proper episode in a minute. I miss you guys. Hope everyone's doing well, now that we're almost at the end of the year.
I know. And speaking of the end of the year, we are prepping for 2023. So if you guys have any topics that we still haven't hit somehow in the last 2 years of this podcast and us all being besties, come let us know over the holidays because we would love to hear from you.
So that means that for the month of November and the month of December, we're just putting out one episode each. That way we can have some time off for the holidays and also prep for 2023. So if you're looking at your podcast feed, wondering why we're not bi-weekly, that's why. But we will be back in your feeds 2023 with some new content, baby.
Yes. And if you miss extra content from us during the holiday season while we're doing this wonky little schedule to get our heads in place for being the best podcast we possibly can be for the new year and just trying to be normal humans, we do have some fun bonus episodes over on our Patreon. Our Music Meltdown, most recent one that we did, we talked about the Kit Connor situation with fans essentially forcing him out of the closet. We had my favorite discussion, which is that nobody owes you their sexuality, no matter who they are or how annoying it might be that you don't know who they're fucking, and that a singular human being cannot queerbait. Queerbaiting is a marketing tactic used by companies, and a singular person cannot do that.
And if you're confused about anything as Sarah is saying right now, you can hear all of the explanation over at patreon.com/name3songs. Individuals not being able to queerbait is definitely the hill that Sarah will die on.
100%. I am very passionate about yelling about this fact. I think it's a really necessary conversation, especially when it's the calling out of people doing this really negatively affects them, as we've seen. Literally, even Emily Carey, who plays young Alicent Hightower from the new Game of Thrones series, she's queer. She goes by she, they pronouns, and people were calling them out for her inner lesbian coming out in her character, portrayal of Alicent, even though the showrunners of the show were like, yeah, no, we wanted them to play as a little bit queer. That was we asked them to do that. And now Emily Carey's not on Twitter either. So these kids,
wow.
Adults on the internet are negatively affecting the mental health of children on the internet. And it's exhausting to watch happen.
That also ties into our conversation today, because we are talking about mental health once again. It's kind of funny because Sarah and I honestly just have these conversations personally a lot. And we feel like we've covered mental health a lot on this podcast, but because Selena Gomez put out her recent documentary, My Mind and Me, detailing her own journey with mental health and discovering she had bipolar disorder. So a lot of the internet's been talking about this lately. We decided to watch the documentary, and as we were thinking about things, we also realized that a lot of musicians lately have been canceling entire tours, citing mental health. So we wanted to dig into this a little deeper and see what exactly is going on.
I thought it was really important because, like Jenna said, while we do bring up mental health quite often in almost every discussion that we wind up having on this podcast, it's important to continuously reiterate how necessary it is to focus on your mental health and discuss it and be open about it, because another thing we mention all the time is that 5-ish years ago, this wasn't a comfortable, normal conversation that people were having. I remember in middle and even high school, when I would be going to therapy after school or whatever the case was, it'd always be one of those whisper words where it's why can't you hang out today? Or why are you leaving practice early? It's oh, I have to go to my therapist. Well, no, not therapy. And I feel like this is a point that Jenna and I mention a lot, and we've never given concrete evidence as to this being a real thing. So I thought, since today's episode is specifically about mental health, we could kind of start off, give you guys some contextual info from some experts in the mental health space about how they have also noticed in the past 5 to 10 years how much better the mental health discourse has become. And this article that I found is a little bit of a bittersweet article because it was published on January 10th of 2020 on NBC News by Nicole Spector, and the title is Mental Health, How We've Improved and Where We Need to Do Better in 2020. Little did she know nobody was doing better at their mental health at all in the year of 2020.
No one was doing better. No one. It's 2022. I don't think we're doing better. I don't think we are.
Oh my God. And so Nicole spoke with Dr. Mark Van Omeren, who is a mental health expert at the World Health Organization. And he said, historically, when people have talked about mental health, they usually meant severe mental illness. But today, mental health can also mean common conditions like anxiety and depression. In more places, though it depends on where you are, people understand mental health simply as an aspect of overall health. Our awareness is shifting and mental health is coming out of the shadows. He continued on to say that I think about this a lot because it's absolutely true internationally. I see more and more governments getting interested in mental health care and more people talking about it. But unlike, say, the #MeToo movement, which is also about a problem that has been in the shadows, there's not one thing that triggered awareness about mental health and caused everyone to see it as a huge thing, which I think is very interesting because I think it was like a slow progressive movement forward of certain celebrities being more open about their disorders and different media and articles and all the sorts of things. And I think also just like in some way, the millennial and younger generations all kind of realizing like, oh, all of my friends are going to therapy after work or like therapy after school or whatever the case is. Like.
This entire conversation is really just thanks to Gerard Way. 2006 Gerard Way, single-handedly responsible for changing mental health. Kind of a joke, but kind of not.
It's all thanks to emo music. Like, it's so funny looking back now because I'm like, oh yeah, I was just like your basic high school emo kid realizing I was mentally unwell because some dude in eyeliner informed me of such.
For real. We got emo music to thank a lot for. But to be fair, I mean, it is people who are willing to start the conversation that make it more normalized for everyone else. So like all of this started somewhere. It takes honestly, a lot of people with public platforms, people like Gerard Way, like who are talking about this in interviews, who are singing songs about how they feel. That helps other people growing up realize that. And I think that has to do with like a lot with our generation and maybe also our generation just being more perceiving of the world and the things we went through and how the world we're going through is not the same world that our parents went through. And this is how slowly over the years we've been able to help normalize this conversation.
Yeah. And I think also it's just like, it's always so interesting to think about the fact that literally women used to go be sent to get lobotomies done when they were mentally unwell back in like the whatever 1800s.
Oh my
or
God.
if they were hysterical, they would be sent to the doctor and the doctor would use a vibrator on them.
Oh my God, I literally cannot believe that is fucking real. That is insane.
But with that being said, I just mean that the research side of the mental health conversation, like the doctor side, the expert side of it, there's been so much more work done to learn and understand that you don't have to go and get your frontal lobe taken out to feel better. That this is a real thing that is the same thing as your brain being sick is the same thing as like your lungs being sick or your heart being sick or whatever the case may be. And so it's a nice marriage of emo music and doctors and people doing things like separately in their own sort of realms where the destigmatization is coming from people you look up to. And there's also destigmatization happening within the expert level of things because they're looking more into this and realizing like, oh, wow, we really don't fucking understand the brain. And I think that that's really interesting. And so with that being said, in this article, Nicole also spoke with Dr. Humphreys, who's a professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at Stanford and the former senior policy advisor of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. And he said that the best thing that happened is multiple sweeping federal laws putting mental health on the same level as physical health. So again, this ties back to like these experts focusing more on like the importance of mental health. And he referenced both the Mental Health Parity and Education Equity Act of 2008 and the Affordable Care Act of 2010, saying, I was at the White House at that time from 2009 to 2010, and it was so extraordinary for me to look and see an essential healthcare benefit defining mental health. It was the dream.
Yeah. Wow. So about 10 years ago, well, 12 years ago at this point, essentially, as we've been saying, since 2010, the conversation has grown a lot. Wow.
It's really interesting, like putting it into that context of people knowing that the focus needs to shift more onto mental health, and it really taking like a Democratic president, because Obama was in office during this time, to make the focus be about this, because no matter like what we can say about these parties, like the Democrats do tend to focus a bit more on health services and access to health services, even though like there's so many hurdles in the way from allowing them to do anything. But the fact that there was so much done that mental health services are accessible on Medicaid and Medicare now. Like when I was unemployed and I was on Medicare, like I could still get my I could still get my antidepressants. I could still get mental health help. And that was like the one thing that I was afraid of like not being able to seek that help, but I still could because of the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, definitely. But I think this is like, because we always talk about this, like, wow, things have really improved, but it's like this, like, literally, like, law happened, law changed, you know? And so this is really sets the stage for what has come in the past 12 years. And also, especially the conversation we're seeing now. And I think, you know, there's countless studies. We're a little close to pandemic still, but I feel like in years to come, we're going to see a lot more studies being done about people and their mental health in this era of things.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, I think at least for me, my first main memory of an artist citing mental health and specifying specifically mental health being why they weren't performing was when Zayn went solo and he was canceling live shows due to his anxiety. Because if you guys listen to our early episodes about One Direction, there always will be the tinge of annoyance in my voice about Zayn leaving One Direction to focus on his mental health and then putting out solo music very soon thereafter. And a little bit of like, oh, okay, he's actually unwell when he started canceling shows, which sounds really fucked up on my behalf. I apologize to Zayn.
I personally would like to apologize to
Zayn. But Olivia Blair for The Independent wrote an article in September of 2016 about how Zayn was canceling his second show in 3 months due to anxiety, and how his first show that was canceled was supposed to be for the Capitol Summertime Ball in June of 2016 because he said that he was dealing with the worst anxiety of his career. And then he canceled a show in Dubai again because of his extreme anxiety and just like not being able to deal with solo performing and all of that stuff. And I mean, like, while Zayn hasn't done a bunch of interviews or anything like that, like he always has been like as open as he felt comfortable with discussing his anxiety and mental health. And I think for 2016, like that was a really big step, especially for somebody who was once in a boy band and was trying to give off kind of like whatever vibe he was trying to give off of, like a cool stoner boy that he was trying to do.
A Bradford bad boy.
Yeah. You know, and so I think it took a lot, especially in 2016, to be so open about that, because even as we learned in the Selena Gomez documentary, like 2016 was when she had to stop her tour, like her world big tour that she was doing for her mental health and just her health in general. But there wasn't a lot of information available then as there is now about like what actually happened to her then and what she was going through and all of that stuff, because she's been more open with it in the years since. But that's because, again, the mental health conversation has just gotten bigger and easier to stomach and deal with for the man.
I think like also for celebrities, I mean, well, our entire podcast is basically dedicated to talking about this, but for celebrities, there's so much more stigma with everything for them. Like there's less wait for like you to tell your friends like you were having mental health issues. Like of course like everyone's going through their own journey and it may not be easy, but it's like your friends are probably going to accept you, hoping that you have good friends. But it's like somebody like Selena, and like even with Demi, it's like there's so much public judgment and pressure. And there was even a point in the doc where Selena was like, I think I'm going to say it, like I think I'm going to tell everyone that I have bipolar disorder. And her manager person, whoever was with her, was like, we're here, we support you, but just know like there's a chance like people may look at you differently. And it's kind of funny because this exactly mirrored the conversation in Taylor Swift's documentary about her supporting a Democratic candidate.
Oh my god.
But Selena was like, well, at the end of the day, like if they're not going to support me and my mental health, then I don't need them, which is very true. But there's just so much more pressure and stigma for artists to like be perfect that I can see how them going to rehab or them going to a mental facility like to get the help they need. It's like, so like even if the public knew she was in like a mental health facility, we don't necessarily know all the details like that are going on until she chooses to share that with everyone.
Well, I mean, the assumption, from my memory of the assumption that there always was around when celebrities were like, oh, yes, I'm going to a facility, I'm going to rehab. It was always for quote unquote exhaustion, which was always code for drugs or alcohol. Whereas now it's like, oh, she like actually was exhausted. But nobody would have ever assumed that at that point where it's like, oh, she's like mentally exhausted, she needs help. Whereas instead they're like, oh, exhaustion, sure, babe, whatever you say. But that point in the documentary about her wanting to put out her statement about her bipolar disorder and what her manager is saying also really resonated with me when I saw that happen, because I was just like, oh shit. Because Selena was like, I wouldn't want to be going through a manic episode in the middle of some project and like not be able to explain it and everybody just think I'm a fucking asshole. And them and like her team kind of being like, once you put it out there, like it's out there, you're never going to forget that. And she's like, well, why the fuck would I want to work with people who aren't okay with me just being me anyway? Yeah. And I think also that just goes to show about like, I think that was also like less recent time. My one issue with the documentary was there was lots of time jumping and I was kind of having a hard time following like what year things were happening in. But I don't think that happened in like 2019. I think that was more of like a 2016, 2017 sort of thing that happened. So I think it's just that thing where it's like now we're like, okay, like everybody struggles with mental health issues. Like nobody's going to be like, oh, you're mentally unwell, I'm not going to work with you. Because that's also discrimination. They can be sued.
Fair and valid point. So the overall takeaway for me from the Selena documentary, along with the documentary coming out, she also had a Rolling Stone cover story, and I thought the cover story actually was like super enlightening. I thought it honed in on a lot of things that weren't 100% clear to me in the documentary, but it really to me showed the weight of what she was actually going through. I just felt like in the documentary it didn't feel as heavy maybe as it like actually was, whereas in the Rolling Stone piece by Alex Morris in November 2022, she kind of detailed Selena's essentially episode in that when at one point when she was admitted to a facility, she was going through psychosis, which means you're like not fully present. Like she was hearing voices, she was like lashing out at her friends and family, which they mentioned in the documentary. But the way that it was I think the way it was just described in writing was like, oh, this was like really serious and like really bad, and it just felt so much more intense to me reading it, putting it in writing. But the thing that like out of all of this, the takeaway was that Selena feels this pressure to use her platform no matter what. It just feels like she's not the type of person to like step away from her platform, even if she's focusing on herself. Because basically the way the documentary was laid out and the way that I've read it here is that as soon as she came out of being in the facility, she like wanted to like start working and wanted to start helping people, and like she's been drawn to various like philanthropy projects. And it's just fascinating to me that like in that point in her life she's like still in recovery, but she's like, no, I have to use my platform. And I think it's really hard I think a lot of artists struggle with this, and I think we've talked about it in various ways on this podcast, of like not being 100% okay with who you are, but still like having to put out music or having to do something for your career. And you can just tell that art like isn't the best thing they've done because they don't really know who they are, what they're trying to do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's like the one thing that I came away from all of this really impressed with Selena about, is like her ability to use what she was going through as a way to like make her music better and try and like make the world better, because she literally like teamed up with the White House and has been working with them to try and help with bringing mental health initiatives to schools and like teaching kids about mental health issues and like why they're important to focus on. And I just think that that's so powerful and incredible that was something that she took away from what she went through, of being like, if I had understood how mental health worked more when I was a kid, then maybe as I was growing up and dealing with this stuff, I wouldn't have just thought like, oh, maybe I'm an asshole. Instead, I would have been like, oh, maybe I'm like unwell. Because she was like, I
Yeah.
literally just thought I was a mean person, and that was like really jarring for me. Like, and I was like, oh wow, I felt like that too, Selena. Like, don't worry, honey. We've all
Oh
gone
my
through that.
God. Oh my God. And so actually, like, going off of Sarah, like talking about her partnering with the White House, like she did some Instagram lives during the pandemic. She's worked with the White House in various ways, but one of those Instagram lives, she talked to Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. And for Rolling Stone, he says, there's something very powerful about what she's doing, not just for other people, but for Selena herself. When you struggle with mental health concerns, it can erode your sense of self, your own self-esteem, and then it makes it harder and harder to reach out to other people. So you enter this downward spiral of loneliness and isolation. Service has the power to break that cycle. So it's essentially like the giving to others, which is philanthropic in nature, helps you have a sense of community, helps you have a sense of purpose, helps you have a sense of connection with other people. So it's crazy that like she's talking to the Surgeon General, and they do the Instagram live like on the documentary, but she's like talking to the Surgeon General like, oh, like how can, you know, people stay connected in this time of isolation? And he's talking about service and he's talking about community, and it just like really hits home with her because that's like everything she's trying to do and communicate and embody.
Yeah. And I think that that's like, again, the other thing that people don't realize, because I think America especially is such like an individualistic country where everybody's always like me first, that people forget how important community is, and they don't really remember until they're back in that kind of realm where they're able to create community and all that stuff. And I think that that's also been an interesting thing that has sprung up during the pandemic, is the ability to work remote, and a lot of people kind of moving into smaller towns, more walkable towns, more community-based towns, and realizing like, wow, my mental health is so much better because I'm building a community. Like, I know my neighbors, I know the people around me, like I feel so much better.
Yeah, it is true that walkable city. I literally read an article in Vice. Maybe I'll link it in here for you guys. There's an article in Vice talking about, there was a study done that literally having to commute everywhere, and our cities that are so driven by cars is making people more prone to isolation and depression.
There is part of me that's always in shock when anybody who works in government admits that how important community is to mental health, and that also that mental health is important, because I'm just like, you're going to uproot America.
Well, it's kind of, I mean, if we want to get really deep into anti-capitalist rhetoric here, you could argue that the way America is set up and the way capitalism is structured inherently divides people, which keeps them mentally unwell, which keeps money going to the healthcare industry, which we know is not very regulated by the government, by the amount of price that they charge for prescriptions and the lack of general insurance in America. So there's that fun conversation too.
Yeah, there's so many layers to it, and so it's just funny when like it gets all meta with like the government acknowledging it, and I'm like, oh shit, we're becoming self-aware, we're gonna fix shit.
But another thing that I do want to point out from the documentary was that the writer Alex Morris for Rolling Stone also talked to the film director, whose name is Alex Kasheshian, and he said that once he began filming, he started to realize that there was a deeper documentary here about a young woman struggling to incorporate her diagnosis. She was fresh out of the mental facility and trying to reconcile the fact that she's still a patient. She's still in the earliest stages of her recovery, but desperately wants to use her platform for good and to talk about it. There's some tension there because obviously she's trying to be an example for others, but she's still not on the other side of it to speak. I thought this was really fascinating. And this was kind of my point a little bit earlier, is that a lot of times artists feel this pressure to like be the best versions of themselves and to use their platform and to like continuously put out music, or like in Selena's case, acting, whatever it is. I guess it's twofold, because like the Surgeon General just said it's therapeutic for her to do acts of service, but at the same time she's like currently going through it while she's trying to help others. But I think like in the documentary, it was just very apparent that she's like, she says so many times, she's like, I have this platform, I might as well use it for good.
Yeah.
And I think that's insane, because it's like she essentially has been acting her entire life, like like since she was 7. And it's like, yeah, if you've built this thing your entire life, you have no other option. Because there's definitely points in the documentary where you could tell she doesn't really say it, but she's like, if I could give all this up, like she might, but she's like, but because God has gifted me with this, like I might as well use it.
Yeah. And I think that that's the one thing that's so impressive about her, just coming from experience of having like horrific mental health days and like knowing that if I went and saw friends or if I exercised or did something, I would feel better. And just being like, no, that's not me. Whereas Selena's like literally going through not only having bipolar disorder, but also her lupus disease, which keeps flaring up and causing her issues. And she's still like going to Kenya and speaking to people and doing all of this work and never stop. Like the grind is never stopping with her because she's just like, I was given this gift of celebrity, of money, of access. I'm going to use my voice where I can. And I think it's really interesting because there's this really clear juxtaposition between like A-listers who mention or talk about their mental health and then touring musicians who mention and talk about their mental health and how that affects them. And I think Selena Gomez is like a gold star A-list person of like dealing with mental health and using that to help others and like not just using it as like a way out or like a way where fans can be like, oh, you're just using this as an excuse. Because I mean, Shawn Mendes canceled his tour that he was supposed to go on and then like went to Miami and was seen on a yacht, and his fans were just like, I thought you were mentally unwell. It's like, what, do you want him to be in a padded fucking room? Like, okay,
you're not allowed to go to Miami. Like, you're okay, mentally ill.
It's like, okay, he's not Selena Gomez, but any person who's ever like he's not going about his mental health struggles in the same way that Selena Gomez has gone about it, of using her experience to help others. But also it's like, if anybody's ever had any form of depressive episode, you know that being in sunshine, being around water and like your friends usually helps. I mean, at least for me, like that's the holy trio, like ocean, friends, and sunshine.
Well, it's just like, you're not the right type of mentally unwell, and therefore your mental unwellness is not valid. It's just that type of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, in Shawn's statement about having to cancel the North American, European, and UK dates of his tour, he said that he wanted to prioritize his mental well-being, and he wrote, I wasn't totally prepared for the toll that being back on the road would take on me. He said, I started this tour excited to finally get back to playing live after a long break due to the pandemic, but reality is I was not at all ready for how difficult touring would be after this time away. After speaking with my team and working with an incredible group of health professionals, it has become more clear that I need to take the time I've never taken personally to ground myself and come back stronger. And I mean, for most people, the pandemic was that time, but I think it's just funny when like A-listers, and to a lot of us, like we're just like, your whole life when you're not out and about being public is a life of luxury that none of us would ever have. And if most of us assume that if we had that, our mental health would be better. But I think in a lot of ways, having that like big house that you probably live in alone and like the constant thought of paparazzi being around and all that, like that is so isolating. And no matter what you can afford to do, there's always like that knowing that if you go on a beach vacation or you go somewhere, like somebody's going to be there with a camera. Like you're never truly allowed to be by yourself to think about what you're going through and all that stuff. And so you just have to have like this different perspective on that. But I think like the main point that I find really interesting and frustrating is just like the levels in which fame work, where like Shawn Mendes canceling this stuff and then going to Miami is something that Shawn Mendes and a very small portion of people in the world can do. Because a lot of people, when they cancel tour for their mental health or whatever reason, that can mean that they're going to have to go back and work at a pub or do something else, because it's like, okay, I just don't have it in me to like deal with the pressures of touring, the pressures of paying for touring, the pressures of like meeting my fans and keeping everybody happy and all of this stuff. Like my mental well-being is not great right now. And then there's so much pressure on me on top of that, of like everything that it comes with going on tour. And for artists like Shawn Mendes or even Zayn Malik or Selena Gomez or whomever, their tours, like a lot of that pressure isn't theirs only. It's like, it's mostly their teams. Like they have teams of people that deal with all of those things. Yeah. And so it is interesting just looking at like this mental health conversation, how everybody from every level and layer of life is able to admit to struggling with mental health issues and be upfront and open and honest with it, but also like acknowledging that everybody from different backgrounds and like wealth levels is going to be able to deal with those things differently.
Yeah,
and understanding that and not taking it out on them because of that, because it's like the way Shawn Mendes deals with his depression or whatever it is he's going through is going to look so much different than like how you or your friends, if you need to take time off work or whatever it is to deal with your mental health, might look like if you even have the ability to take time off work to deal with your mental health.
True. I'm definitely not going on Miami on a boat when I took a day off work. No, but it's true. And we have a wonderful article in The Guardian, probably one of our favorite publications. They do such good reporting. But Laura Barton, September of this year, titled, This Should Not Be Normalized, Why Musicians Are Canceling Tours to Protect Their Mental Health. And in this article, they talk to Joe Hastings of Help Musicians, which is a nonprofit organization in the UK that helps musicians with their mental health. And they said, like, basically across the board, they've seen a significant increase as compared to earlier pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. He says, after a protracted period of relative inactivity, there have been heightened numbers of people coming to us about stress, anxiety, and performance-related anxiety. And it goes on to say that the way artists are articulating their experiences wasn't this common even 5 years ago. So again, just another professional in the mental health / music industry also saying the same thing. Artists are across the board talking about this way more. And I thought this article was just really fascinating because they talked to a lot of artists of different levels, and they started it by talking to Yard Act, which is the Leeds post-punk band. And they said, in January, their touring schedule had been relentless. Critical acclaim and a Mercury nomination had only amplified the pressure. Bigger bookings kept coming, and the band was determined to play them all. And the singer James Smith says, that weekend we were playing at Castle with the Flaming Lips. It was a dream come true. You feel ungrateful saying you can't do it. And so then it comes back to this music industry conversation of, well, if I don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. And if I don't keep up the momentum, people might forget about me and I might lose my chance to break my career.
Yeah. And I think that that's the other issue and part of the point I was making before about how like A-listers in some senses have it a lot easier to make these decisions because while they are going to hurt it's going to hurt their fans and like they won't be bringing in as much money that quarter or whatever the case is, like it's not going to affect them as negatively as it would for a band who makes all of their money from touring and merch sales, because these artists have other forms of income and like they're already an established name. And like when an artist is becoming established, there is that scarcity mentality of just like, I need to keep going until I physically cannot anymore, no matter what the fuck it is I'm going through, because if I don't, someone else is going to come in. And so it's like intrusive thoughts on top of intrusive thoughts and like mental health on top of mental health. And there's so many layers to it. And I feel like because these artists are smaller, most of the times these conversations aren't really happening about them like they are. We're not seeing countless news articles about like Wet Leg or Sam Fender or whomever it is canceling their tours, whereas we do have like countless news articles about Shawn Mendes canceling his tour to the point where there was like, oh, Shawn Mendes cancels his tour. Oh, fans are mad that Shawn Mendes canceled his tour. Shawn Mendes responds to fans that are mad that he canceled his tour. And it's like Shawn Mendes just got 3 different types of article written about him following this, whereas like Wet Leg are lucky, or this band Yard Act would be lucky to have even one article mention the fact that they couldn't go on tour and like maybe share like, oh, you can donate money or buy merch to help them during this time.
Going back to the point of a lot of these musicians, if they're not touring, they have to take up other jobs because they're not at a point where this is sustainable. They also mentioned that this week Arlo Parks became the latest, canceling a run of US shows, explaining how the relentless grind of the past 18 months had left her, quote, exhausted and dangerously low. And her decision also came after Sam Fender's announcement that he was canceling his US tour, supporting Florence and the Machine. And he says, it seems completely hypocritical for me to advocate the discussion of mental health and write songs about it if I don't take time to look after my own mental health.
And I think that that's what's so important, again, is like staying true to yourself is the most important thing. And like taking care of yourself is the most important thing. And it's so hard to come to that understanding, to come to that decision of being like, well, shit, like I've made my whole entire platform off of the fact that I think, like, especially in Sam Fender's case, who we've talked about when we did our like men in music and mental health episode a while ago, about how he's always been like a very prominent like advocate for men to go to therapy and talk about their mental health and realize that like punching shit isn't the way to deal with things, and you should talk about your problems and admit to them and talk to your friends about what they're going through. And so for somebody to be that aware of how important mental health is, but then also to be like, I got to keep going because my career is like on this all-time high, and being like, oh, actually, like I'm gonna burn out, and it could honestly kill me if I don't stop. And it takes a lot of strength to be able to admit that to yourself, especially in this kind of industry. But also, I think that we shouldn't have to say like, oh, it takes a lot of strength to admit that and do that in this kind of industry. I think that it should be the norm. Like, you shouldn't feel forced to tour.
I mean, the industry pre-pandemic was bad about this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was like, honestly, I can't even think of an artist. I mean, Selena, that would be the example. But like, personally, an artist that I listen to, I can't think of an artist that canceled a tour due to mental health issues pre-pandemic. It's like a sin in the industry. It's like canceling a tour, unheard of. Like, you don't do it. But then this article also mentions that the industry is desperate to spring back to life after a devastating pandemic with turbocharged touring and promotional schedules to make up perceived lost time. And I think that's what a lot of these artists are facing right now. It's like, okay, well, like, you're exciting right now. Let's just hit the road. Like, let's just go and like build you up now that like we're allowed to tour. We can tour. But it's also like, we've been in 2+ years of a pandemic, and like, maybe not everyone has really worked through their own mental health in this time period. Like, a lot of traumatic shit happens, and if you aren't like actively going to therapy, then like probably gonna leave some like traumatic kind of PTSD type feelings in the back of your brain.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also there is probably that part of these artists' minds who are like, my friends who are my touring crew didn't have any work. Like, they weren't making any money through what they've trained to do throughout this pandemic. Like, I don't want to let them down. So it's a whole other level from before, where it was just like, oh, like, I'm gonna let my fans down, I might not bring money in. It's also like, wow, my friends have been out of work, like having to work at like Home Depot or wherever for the past like 2 years to make money, and now I'm gonna have to cancel this tour because I can't deal with it. There's so much pressure from so many different directions, and nobody is meaning to put that pressure onto them, except for maybe fans, because we're all assholes to our favorite artists most of the time. But in the grand scheme of things, it's like there's so much going on in your head. Because I mean, even just thinking about like, as a regular person, like when you need to cancel things, or like if your company makes you feel like taking sick days is like something that you shouldn't be doing, like you feel like shit when you tell them like, oh, I can't do this, even though you know that like it's your right to take a day off or whatever the case is. Like, there's so many other consequences or whatever coming at you that you're like, what do I do now? Because I know what I should do, but I don't know how people are going to react to what I should be doing.
Yeah. Lots of expectations. I mean, so to your point about all of this, about the expectations of people and the expectations on musicians and the stuff that like we don't think about as music consumers, Santigold had to cancel an entire US tour before it even started, literally saying, I can't afford this tour. Like, they're telling me I'm going to do this tour, and I'm literally going to lose money doing this. And she has 3 kids at home. And it's like, why the fuck would she spend the time and the fucking energy to come back and make $0 and have 3 kids at home to feed? Like, that's fucking insane. And so she canceled a tour. She ended up doing a really long interview with Aaliyah Gillespie in October of this year. Like, again, all of this is happening at the same time. It was really enlightening. And she talks like in depth a lot about many of the issues, breaking down a lot of what's going on. So definitely recommend you guys read this after if you want to find out more. Again, just talking about the fact that like post-pandemic, like our lives are different than they were before. Like things are generally more expensive. And she goes like talking about a lot of the bottom line stuff, saying it affects the bottom line too, because if you're not doing enough shows on tour, you're not able to pay for the tour. So there's gas, and basically just with the inflation alone, that eats up profit. But then not to be able to put on as many shows, well, that adds to it. We put on anchor dates on tours that are festivals or private gigs, so that would offset, because I'm selling, I don't know, max maybe 4,000 capacity venues, which is not small, but it's not like I'm going to be rolling in dough. And then a lot of the promoters are having a hard time. So the guarantees are getting smaller and they're offering us less money, but the prices are going up. Fans can't afford the ticket prices. We all know about that. It's just a perfect storm, and you're heading out depleted. You put out a record basically for free. It costs a lot of money to make the record. Videos cost money, marketing costs money, but you put it out and you give it away for free. And then it's like, go find yourself some way to eat. Insane. Like this article was horrific. This interview was like literally horrific, and like what musicians are dealing with today.
Yeah. It was so sad to read this article, because it's like, we know how much us as fans love music, and just imagine that times 10, because it's like the artists are the ones creating this music, and that music means so much to them, and getting to share it with their fans. Like, all of that is like a very healing, incredible experience. And it's like, imagine somebody's like, yeah, you've worked your whole entire life to become a touring musician, to have enough success where you don't have to have other jobs. Like, you can make a salary touring, being an artist, whatever. And then that gets taken away from you, to the point where you're like, how the fuck do I keep even doing this? And like, that disappoints you, that disappoints your fans, that disappoints like a whole array of people. But also, when you look at it logistically speaking, it's like, none of this fucking makes sense, because nobody wins in the end. It's we all have that like post-concert high for like, what, 5 hours? Like, if you're lucky, it lasts for a day. And like, oh, at the end of the day, you're like, oh shit, like, thanks to Ticketmaster being a fucking conglomerate, I spent $175 on what should have been a $30 concert ticket, because Ticketmaster raises prices based off of how many people are sitting on Ticketmaster at that time when you bought your fucking ticket. And then it's like, oh, I spent all this money on gas, and then I spent money on food, and I spent money on this. And then it's like, okay, the artist also spent money on gas and food. And so the artist has all of those fees and more on top of them to deal with, and they just want to do their job and they can't, and nobody's trying to help them be able to do their job. And it's just so upsetting, because on top of all of that, it's like, they also have to deal with the mental health struggles that we're all dealing with from the trauma of the pandemic, whatever mental health issues they already had, and everything else. And it's like, all of this can only negatively affect their mental health. But to positively affect their mental health, they have to not do the thing that they want to do. Like, it's so ass backwards.
I know. Well, Santigold says this too, that a lot of this is kind of fucked because of the streaming industry, because when we stopped paying for music, musicians lost out on a lot of money. And I will say, you know what? To K-pop's credit, this is the one thing they do right, is they know how to sell albums. They know how to move some units. But Santigold says, I don't know any other job that you have to pay to do your job and end up in debt.
MLMs.
Okay, but I'm thinking about like actors. They get paid up front.
No, I just think it's funny that being a musician is essentially like being in an MLM. They're like, oh, you have talent, you want to sell that talent? Give us money and take out a loan with us, and like spend the rest of your life paying that back. Maybe you'll make a cent. If you do well, like, you could get 1,000 Teslas and a mansion. But like, only so many people do that well. It's literally like it's a pyramid scheme. Yeah,
it kind of is. But I was just like thinking in relationship to like movie stars. It's like actors get paid from the production companies, and the production companies either have deals with people like Netflix and they get their money from advertisers and subscribers, or they go to cinema and they make money on ticket prices. And it's like, what is the equivalent of that model for music? And I think we lost that when streaming came in, because we don't pay for albums, we don't pay for music. So it's like, literally the art that musicians are putting out, we do not pay for. We do not pay for music videos. We do not pay for streaming. We do not pay, unless you buy a physical copy of their album. We directly do not pay artists unless you buy their merchandise. Or their tour tickets, but we already know how much goes into the tour.
And that speaks so much of like just the drastic change in like even the amount of albums, the number one album even sold in like 2010 in comparison to now.
Yeah.
It's so drastically different.
Like when NSYNC and Britney were breaking records, they were selling millions of copies. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure when Machine Gun Kelly got a number,
it was like 119,000.
Yeah,
albums.
It was like super low when Machine Gun Kelly got
We're mentioning him because he's the only person we're going to remember.
Yeah, we're mentioning him because he's like, the only like not A-lister, so like kind of A-lister but not celebrity who like said how many records. This is just fried into our brains. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. From our MGK days.
But it's like I think like I mean like Taylor Swift can Taylor Swift, Drake, Adele, like they can move copies, but like Machine Gun Kelly, he wasn't up against anyone. He had sold like less than 200,000 copies. That's nothing. That's like it's insane how nothing that is.
Yeah.
And like addition to all of this like financial debt that you go into, Santigold did also bring up something I thought was really interesting about like the emotional toll that it takes on you, going back to mental health. Like it's not just a financial toll. She says touring is basically crisis management, like getting to the venue, like anything can happen. You just have to be prepared to handle conflicts. But then you go on stage and you're like screaming hello to 30,000 people. It's a very different requirement energetically, spiritually, mentally, and you have to carry that night after night after night, 5 shows a week at least. And that's assuming you have a crowd that's interested in what you're doing. Yeah. Imagine having a crowd where like you're not the headliner, you're like the opener, and the crowd is like not giving you that energy back. It's sad, y'all.
Yeah. It's so sad. Like that can be so disheartening to artists where it's like they get invited out onto massive tours and the crowd doesn't know them. Sometimes the crowd doesn't even show up until after. Like they'll literally like call the venue to find out like, oh, when does the headliner go on, etc.
I remember growing up going to emo concerts and there were fucking 5 bands on the bill.
Yeah.
And it used to be that the reason they did that is it helped get people to the shows and it helped sell tickets. And sometimes those bands even had to pay to be on that tour, but that's a whole other like very complicated and messy discussion. But it's like, that's why we had openers. Was because it would like bring in more money, and now it like literally doesn't. Like I feel like it would be more like, as awful as it sounds, don't quote me on this, I'm not an expert in touring, but I feel like it would be more financially stable for artists to not have touring bands.
Honestly, maybe, because even just thinking about like the personal stress I was going through, like thinking about buying a ticket to see Florence and the Machine just to see Sam Fender. Number one, I would have had to have spent like $145 to get like a crappy seat to see an artist that I really love open for an artist I don't listen to. Yeah. Like number two, it's like, okay, I'm paying that much money just to see an opener because I would have left. But on top of that, it's like, will I even get a ticket? And so it's like, okay, yeah, it's great for his career that he gets to do a really big tour like that in the US and whatever, and like it'll expand his name and everything like that. So as a fan, it's like, okay, I want to support that. But also it's like, for the fans of the openers, when they do open for those big tours, again, it's like that mental health gymnastics of being like, okay, seeing Sam Fender will be great for me personally, but spending all this money to see Sam Fender play an 8-song set when last year I paid $30 to see him play like a 14-song set in like a venue where I could see him. Yeah. Like it's a whole thing.
I mean, I guess technically, going back on my word, the reason that artists also tour with bigger artists is that so they can get more fans.
Yeah, but I mean, like a lot of the times though, like especially the artists we grew up seeing when they wore like that like 4 to 5 band tours, it's like they all came with their own fan bases. They all had very similar music. They were all not that much bigger than each other.
Yeah.
And so it very much felt just like an event. It was like an evening out. It was like a whole thing. Whereas now it's like, when you go see like Harry Styles, it's like, yes, he has one opener and these openers are artists that Harry likes. And so therefore you're going to go support them because our parasocial relationships with Harry are like that fucking unhinged. But at the same time, it's like, you might not like that music. You might not, whatever the case is. And that artist might have their own fans that doesn't want to shell out the money for a Harry Styles concert or like spend the time to deal with that, because it's like, Blood Orange is going to have completely different fans than Harry would. This is
true.
It's just like it's just a whole other thing. So it's like, okay, yeah, that did definitely gain Blood Orange new fans, but also it's like, are you also not excluding your already existing fan base. Like there's lots of levels to it.
Yeah.
And that's a completely different discussion, I think. But it is the interesting thing of just thinking like all of these things, like money and mental health, go very much hand in hand.
Yeah.
Your ability to like have money, make money, etc., have a lot to do with like how you feel mentally.
Because we need money to pay rent and buy food.
Yeah.
Capitalism,
Exactly.
baby.
So gotta love capitalism.
Gotta love it.
There's lots of layers here that tie all of this in together, which is upsetting and I guess in some ways like nice that like you can wrap up so nicely like why these things affect each other so much. But it's also just like it's just so much to deal with, especially when I think, and like this could be a bold statement to make, but I think that music is more of a universally understood thing than like cinema or media in that regard, like cinema or like television, etc., because it's like everybody can enjoy music at different levels. But even if you're not like a diehard fan, it's cool to go see an artist in concert. Whereas like if you're not a diehard fan of like going to the movies, like you'll pay for like HBO Max, but you're not going to pay to go to the movie theater. And it's like a very different thing. Whereas like music universally seems to be more of like a moment you like to experience with friends or like alone, but in person, like with that artist. And so that on top of that, it's weird when like music is like a mental health remedy for a lot of people, and yet music and the touring industry so negatively affects the artist's mental health in a lot of ways because of how fucked it is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and not just the touring industry. Like we're talking about people canceling tours, but it's like the expectation to post on TikTok, the expectation to be a TikTok expert, like to be likable on the internet, and like the streaming situation. Like it's just all around like a really bad deal of cards for musicians if you're not an A-lister. And bringing it back to the Guardian article, they also talk to music journalist Ian Winward, who's the author of Bodies, a book that offers insight into the unhealthy demands of the music industry. And one thing that he said is that there's a fear among musicians that if they ever complain, audiences with, quote, proper jobs outside the music industry will think that they are ungrateful. But it's also worth remembering one thing. If an artist has risen to a point where people know their name, they are already tough, they're already resilient. So if they're telling you that they're broken, believe them. That's scary. That's heavy.
Yeah, that is really heavy. But I think that mindset is so scary and horrible to me because it's like, it's just that constant want to take people down that seem to have more than you or seem to live like a more privileged or interesting life than you. And it's like when we talk about like tabloid culture or when fans like bullied Jessie Nelson about her body and weight and how she dressed and all those sorts of things, and other artists like that, where it's like these people think like, oh, they're impervious because they're famous and have money and have success and they do something that I wish I could do, but like I don't have the skill set to do that. And it's like, no, we're all still human at the end of the day. And I think that that's like the most important takeaway from this conversation and this idea and this focus on mental health going forward is like, at the end of the day, we are all human. And this is something that we always need to be reminded of, because I think even sometimes like in a 9-to-5 job, even like I feel like there's so often like bosses and whatever forget that people are human, people are going through stuff. Like if somebody's workload is not as impressive as it once was, like rather than reprimand them, maybe ask like, are you okay? Like what are you going through? I think that this is where the mental health conversation needs to be able to get to. It needs to get to that point where people need to realize like, oh, if somebody I care about or whatever, if no matter how privileged I think their life is or how good they are at their job or whatever the case is, if all of a sudden they're not doing that thing, like maybe think about what the hell could be going on in their life that all of a sudden like they're less active on the internet or not giving as much in their work or whatever the case is. And I feel like that's always like the most important takeaway from all of this is like remembering at the end of the day,
living their life with more compassion.
Yeah, exactly. It's so important.
Yeah, that is really important to just have compassion for yourself and others. And kind of like one final thing I wanted to end on was this idea that drug, sex, and rock and roll also came along with a lot of mental health. So again, this journalist Winward, he was describing an interview with a dope sick Lane Staley from Alice in Chains, clearly in no fit state to face the media, and hearing Simon Neil from Biffy Clyro recounting the time that he, quote, collapsed in Toronto airport, placed on a gurney, wires sticking out of him, but still went on to play 2 Coachella shows because, quote, he had trained himself to believe that the band's career rested on 2 concerts, which I think is insane, but it just like sparked this thought in my head that was like, oh, yeah, I mean, that's probably why they were always on drugs and like drinking, and there were so many health problems and so many people died so young in that era because they all had mental health issues and nobody knew how to deal with it.
Nobody knew what they were. Like, it's like, oh, I'm feeling like this. What is this? Like, the terms like having anxiety and depression and that sort of stuff were like no words, where it's like, oh, she's hysterical, you know, like that sort of thing, where it's like, rather than being like, oh, she's like, her mental health is bad, it's like she's hysterical or whatever the case is. So there's just not, there wasn't just,
they didn't have the same language.
Yeah,
there wasn't the same language to understand, and there wasn't, but also I think more importantly, there wasn't the same access to healthcare that there is now, and this is why this conversation is so different. But and like, because I was like, oh well, it's just like rock and roll, like it's just the era of like drugs, sex, and rock and roll. But it's like, no, like it was that era because they didn't know what else to do with themselves. Like, so I don't know, it's kind of interesting just thinking back on it that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with all that being said, like just remember, like there is only one of you. Like, if you run yourself down, your battery is going to run out. And you need to remember to take care of yourself at the end of the day. And that if you need to take care of yourself at the end of the day, so do your favorite artists, and just give them a bit of leeway in that direction. If they do cancel tours or whatever, like it completely makes sense to be sad when you thought you were going to get to see your favorite artist and then all of a sudden you can't. But I think just remember that like they're going through shit just like you are, and we've all dealt with an extended trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, on top of like humanizing artists and treating people with kindness, all our favorite Harold Styles, I think it's just the conversation here is interesting because of the trend of things that we've seen happening, and like how we're gonna see this change and affect the music industry, and the music industry affect the mental health, and like all this, how we're going to see this going forward.
Yeah, agreed. 100%. So if you guys have any thoughts or feelings or comments on anything that we discussed today and would like to further converse with us, you can do so by sliding into our DMs on social media. I guess maybe just Instagram at this point. We'll see where Twitter's at, but we are at Name 3 Songs on all platforms. Or if you have any personal beef or positive thoughts you'd like to share with us personally, you can find me at Sarah_Fagan and Jenna at Jenna_Million. So thanks for joining us on this episode of Name 3 Songs, and until next time, never let anyone make you feel bad about your favorite band.
And remember, you're never too cool to listen to Selena Gomez.
Don't forget to subscribe to be notified when each episode comes out, and leave us a 5-star review. They really help.
If you want to find out more about any of the sources we referenced in this episode, you can visit name3songs.com.